Hi, I'm Dalison, and I'm here to propose a research project to investigate the experience of hallucinations amongst the Aboriginal people in Australia. Firstly, before we continue, I would like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and to recognise their ongoing connection to land, waters, and culture. My respects goes to all elders past, present, and emerging. This research submission will refer to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders as First Nations. First Nations people are experiencing higher mental health issues than other Australians, which also happens to be double the burden of disease in Australia. The prevalence of schizophrenia and psychosis is very much well above other Australians and the global reporting rates. Global reporting is as low as 0.2 to 0.4%, whilst First Nations people report 1.7%, 4 times higher. First Nations people are more than twice as high when compared to other Australians. However, the Aboriginal people are 3 times higher than Torres Strait Islanders. The purpose of investigating the experiences of hallucinations amongst the Aboriginal people is due to hallucinations being the key symptom of schizophrenia and psychosis. Hallucinations may be auditory, visual, or olfactory, and are accompanied by a disturbance in thinking, such as delusions and paranoia. However, hallucinations are commonly accepted within the Aboriginal communities. They form a part of their grieving practices and rituals. Therefore, it requires investigating the hallucinatory experiences to understand if Aboriginal people are actually experiencing schizophrenia-related disorders or simply experiencing hallucinations as part of their cultural practices and rituals. The Western understandings of hallucinations do not take into consideration the cultural practices and rituals of Aboriginal people. Mental health holds different meanings for the Aboriginal people, such as schizophrenia being referred to as anxiety. This highlights immediately a different understanding from Western definitions. There is also a greater likelihood of psychiatric disorders when individuals are exposed to high psychological distress. There are many historical factors that have left the Aboriginal people exposed to high levels of psychological distress, which began with colonisation and invasion. Historical factors include various ways in which the Aboriginal people have been exposed to higher psychological distress. Colonisation targeted Aboriginal people deliberately, which created displacement and distance from the resources they relied upon, from the land. The arrival of white people from foreign lands disrupted a civilization that are reported to have been here for over 60,000 years. The dispossession of their land arose from early declarations that Australia was terra nullius, which means land belonging to no one. However, the land belonged to Aboriginal people, and evidence suggests that they were relatively fit and disease-free, living off the native foods of the land. Violence and conflict followed, whereby murders and raping contributed to the demoralisation of Aboriginal people. It was accompanied by the poisoning of their food and water supply. There was a period of stolen generations, children taken from their families and homes and placed into white people's homes. This caused much grief, trauma, and disruption to Aboriginal people, family, community, and kinship. This deep history of oppression and disruption has left their communities with poorer health outcomes due to social and environmental factors. It is known that social and emotional well-being is directly linked to trauma and loss. There was also the introduction of alcohol into small and remote communities that subsequently became reliant upon economic funding. Heavy misuse of alcohol and other substances, such as petrol sniffing and cannabis, contributes to developing schizophrenia-related symptoms such as hallucinations. There are various limitations and gaps in the research literature, such as limited information prior to colonisation. This results from the poor treatment and care towards Aboriginal people. Much of the historical information has been dismissed, misreported, or covered up during colonisation period. There is also research suggesting that intellectual impairment for those receiving treatment for schizophrenia-related disorders, these behaviours are reportedly consistent with intellectual disability. There is a lack of culturally appropriate tools and intervention. Whilst other Australians use tools such as Beck's Depression Inventory or the Mental State Examination, those that have been developed for Aboriginal people are using culturally applicable language such as the Here and Now Aboriginal Assessment, Strong Souls Social and Emotional Wellbeing Assessment Tool, and Words for Feeling Map. The differences in the title of these tools highlight the language needs to be culturally appropriate. There is limited involvement of Aboriginal health workers in assessment and intake, which leaves Aboriginal people vulnerable and exposed to miscommunications and language barriers. Their inclusion would be beneficial to represent their culture and language. There is also a concerning lack of research amongst Aboriginals and other Australians. The alarming health gap between Aboriginal people and other Australians highlights that greater effort is needed to explore and understand the higher prevalence rates. Research does not provide insight into the experience of hallucinations and the relationships with substance abuse that is being reported. When reporting the relationships for substance abuse and hallucination, what occurred first is not being reported, just that there is a comorbidity between the two without reference to psychosocial variables. The research question to be answered is what is the meaning and understanding of hallucinations amongst Aboriginal people? The purpose of this research is to gather information from Aboriginal people in both remote, non-remote settings to identify a rich and broad understanding about their views, beliefs, and perspectives of hallucinations. This is important research so as to understand the cultural differences in experiences of hallucination, which may explain the higher prevalence rates. We have already come to learn that Aboriginal people view schizophrenia as anxiety. This is an example of the cultural differences that exist between Aboriginal people and other Australians. This may then support the design of culturally appropriate assessment and intervention tools. The collection of qualitative data will provide information of multiple realities from within the Aboriginal community that will lead to the generation of new understandings of this phenomenon. This data will be of high ecological validity as the conclusions that arise will be relevant to their population. The participants will be Aboriginal people and will require the inclusion of Aboriginal health workers so that the language is culturally applicable and representative. The procedure will be a collection from face-to-face interviews and will require travelling to remote communities. The data will be subjected to interpretive phenomenological analysis. The IPA process will identify themes and through a collaborative humanics process will provide understanding of their meaning and experiences of hallucinations. The IPA method involves lived experience and meaning making and therefore is the most applicable to understand the lived experience of hallucinations by Aboriginal people. This may lead to new discoveries of the meaning and experience of hallucinations for them. We need to understand that Aboriginal people encompass many languages, histories, and cultures with rich detail of connection to land that comes with a painful history starting from colonisation. It is important that Aboriginal health workers are involved in clinical settings so that language is contextually and culturally appropriate. Through this research, we can develop new understandings of the social and emotional well-being of Aboriginal people, and it may support clinical assessment to ensure diagnosis of schizophrenia-related disorders is correct. This may lead to the development of assessment tools and interventions that are culturally appropriate. It is time to understand our country's first people and recognise and acknowledge our differences. Thank you.